Hello my friends, Rekindling here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. You all really know what it is that you want. As you know, the way that things work when we do these types of videos is that you all post in the comments section the type of suggestions that you want for alternate history scenarios. We take the top 4 most liked scenarios, and we slap that into a poll for you all to vote on. In this case, yeah, I know I screwed this up and I accidentally double pasted this. I understand. But still, the overwhelming majority of you ended up wanting to do what if the UK and Japan had remained allies into World War II. I am definitely going to need to address this here going into the next one. I'm sorry about that for the person that I ended up screwing up and actually not posting their suggestion. So yeah, what would have happened if Japan had remained allies with the UK? Well, a lot of things would be different, I can tell you that much right now, but oh dear God, the amount of things that have to change prior to the war beginning in order to make that possible is immense. Also, I just switched something up here. I know one of the complaints that I've gotten to my previous videos is that the screen is a little bit blurred at different times, so I'm changing the UI so it's significantly larger for you all to be able to see things on it. So yeah, now hopefully things are significantly more clear. But yes, what if Japan had actually allied with the UK? How do we make that possible? Technically speaking, there's multiple ways that we can actually go and explain this. The two primary distinctions that must be made is first answering the question of, okay, is Japan militaristic? Because if it is, then there's going to need to be a series of things that kind of take place in order to make them ally with the UK. And if they are less militaristic, then what happened in order to make that possible? Because that is, technically speaking, the path that you would need to follow through here with strengthened civilian government in order to be able to go and rekindle the old alliance with the UK. This is the clean path to do it, so to speak. You could, technically speaking, do either purge the Kotoha faction or support the Kotoha faction and then go down and help the UK in some way, but you're not really going to be able to easily join with them in an alliance. And I know that a number of people are going to say, oh, well, if you support the Kotoha faction, then you're preparing for war with the Soviet Union and you're still going to join the London Naval Treaty and make friends and whatnot. So this seems like it is the thing to support the UK, but no, the Kotoha faction, if this doesn't really make as much sense as a path for how it's represented. Because the Kotoha faction, if it was supported, never would have really joined the London Naval Treaty, I don't think. The thing that people don't really get about this faction as it existed in the 1930s, as it's one of the two big militaristic groups, is that not only did it want to restore the authority of the emperor, but simultaneously, they were really anti-Western, they were very militaristic, they wanted to expand and take over more things, and they wanted to do all of that with the emperor being the guy that made the decision to do it. So yeah, we could make an alternate history of what if the Kotoha faction had actually succeeded. That is indeed true, right? But it's just not really realistic to assume that this kind of anti-Western group taking over Japan would then go, oh yeah, we're totally going to ally with the UK. Like it doesn't really align. So yeah, we will be following the democratic strength in the civilian government path, which I will say as part of the base game in HOI4 is one of the worst paths in this entire game. It genuinely is, but we're going to be doing things a little bit different than how it's represented in game because we have to kind of assume some different things about Japan in the first place. And yeah, honestly, my friends, when we talk about all this, it's true. The world is just absolutely filled with scams and corruption. And in a world where your online privacy is constantly under threat, do you know who's actually watching you? Whether it's hackers or the government or something like that, your data is a commodity and it's being sold to the highest bidder constantly. Which is why I'm actually happy to introduce today's sponsor, Private Internet Access, or PIA VPN. For those of you who are unaware, Private Internet Access is the world's most transparent VPN provider, with over 30 million downloads and available across all devices from Mac to Linux to Android and more. Plus, it never stores your data. It simply hides your IP address and encrypts your internet connection. In this way, it goes and shields your digital life in the eyes of your internet service provider, the network administrators, or government censors, which for many of the countries that I cover can be a massive pain for their citizens, as I'm sure many of you are aware by now. Along with those features, as a great bonus, this VPN lets you access streaming content all over the world that you normally can't touch. You've probably seen by now, my wife and I travel a lot for work, and one of her favorite shows on Netflix is this Danish show called Baby Fever. She literally cannot watch it without a VPN putting her IP in Denmark. It's just not available here in the United States. Genuinely, my friends, in a day and age where everything seems more uncertain and dangerous, having a VPN to protect yourself is becoming more and more necessary by the minute. So by all means, go to piavpn.com/Rekindling or click the link down in my description and get 83% off a 2-year plan plus 4 months free. That is just $2.03 per month. Thanks again to PIA for sponsoring today's video, and now back to the show. First off, regarding background, in the 1930s, things obviously did not go well for Japan with the Great Depression. Things went very poorly, and because of how this negatively affected the economy, it affected society, etc., this is one of the things that drove a lot of people into actually supporting the military in the first place, and Japan becoming more militaristic. That was a really big thing that did happen. Thus, we can only really assume that Japan's economy going into this time is actually stronger. We can arguably say that the military maybe suffered more defeats, like in the case of maybe something like Rekindling against the Soviet Union happened earlier. There were further skirmishes that went poorly in Japan's favor, and maybe even some ones that they were kind of embarrassed down here in China. Things that maybe even the Navy had a number of scandals that created issues that weakened the overall political support that the military, both on the Navy side and the Army, would receive. So we can't just assume, oh, well, the Army failed, so that means the Navy got more influence, and thus Japan pursues a strike south doctrine. We have to say that both were embarrassed in some way, and it really just reduces the overall prestige of the military to a degree, thus allowing more efforts to be focused on economics versus anything else. And at the same time, we have to assume that some of the assassinations just did not succeed or didn't happen in the first place. Yeah, a lot of members of the military in Japan over the course of like the 1920s heading into the 1930s were assassinating members of the civilian government in order to exert their power and influence. We need to say that a bunch of that didn't happen or just straight up didn't succeed. So then, with instant construction turned on, what we will really say is that the Japanese government in the years prior to the 1936, instead of focusing more efforts on, say, military and that aspect, that things were focused more on the civilian side. Now, we're not going to reduce the number of military factories because we have a hard time removing factories in the first place, but we can say that with a stronger economy, maybe they got lucky and some of the worst effects of the Great Depression didn't hit Japan as hard. Then this means that there would have been more money that could have been used not only for more infrastructure and civilian goods, but they would have been able to maintain the same level of military production, specifically because they already have more money to do so. To that end, we're not necessarily going to do too much. We're just going to give like 4 or 5 civilian factories. That's all we're doing. No more military, no more anything, just a little bit of infrastructure and more civilian factories. It's a stronger overall economy. And so, okay, with the economy out of the way, the next question is, what are we exactly going to be doing politics-wise? We have to assume that in this time that the militarists never really took over the country. So yeah, we are going to have to go through the Civil War in order to actually change things in-game, but we need to really assume that a careful balance had instead been struck over the course of the 1920s heading into the 1930s, and that eventually the civilian government does come out on top. There's maybe some contention about this, but overall, the military is never able to really fully take over like it is that they do in our own time. So, to that end, civilian government is strengthened. The increasing values of liberalism and democracy, far from being a threat to our nation, could be the greatest strengths. We must ensure our government is strengthened so that it can protect these ideals. That is already done. More efforts were specifically already spent on R&D. The Zaibatsus were already allied with in order to be able to secure the economy as it was over the course of the Great Depression, which is going to then help us here. The largest corporations of our nation have long had unprecedented political and economic power. They are a testament to all the opportunities freedom and individually allow, and we must seek to work together with them for the good of the nation. And finally, the militarists are purged. Those who believe military force is the answer to everything must be purged from our islands. If we are to make room for more level-headed thinking, they can find their own way outside of our borders. With these 4 things out of the way, we're pretty much needing to do a throwaway thing for the time being, so we're going to do the Army expansion law and just get that out of the way as we let democracy go ahead and tick up within society. Now, here is where a really big change happens. In February of 1936, one of the things that ended up taking place is that there was an attempted coup by the Kotoha faction, where a number of officers tried to essentially take over the government, and it didn't really work. And this is the thing that ended up leading to the purging of the Kotoha faction, which we can't even see in here anymore since we went down the democracy path and it's no longer available. But what we can arguably say is that something similar in this takes place. The tentative balance that is maintained between the democratic forces, I just hit a thing on my desk, but the tentative balance that is created between the democratic forces and the militaristic forces finally reaches a boiling point. The military tries to attempt a coup, or the Kotoha faction within the military does. This fails horribly, and it either sparks a minor internal conflict or, in general, leads to an outright major purging of the military from positions of power. This is honestly the most likely answer to take place with everything that we have described. So, even though it's not really high enough in here yet, we can definitely cheat in order to make this possible. And with this tentative balance struck, that means in February or March of 1936, A preemptive coup takes place. We must strike first and secure the future of our nation for our children, lest our ideals are stamped out by authoritarian government. Yeah, essentially just the purge takes place here in this time after the failed assassination attempts that would have happened during the Kodaha coup. Dear God, why can I not speak? And yeah, Democratic elements in the government have instigated a surprise takeover of the country, which in this case, specifically what we're talking about is a purging of the militarists who failed to take over the government, after the military threatened to once again curb the people's hard-earned democratic rights. With a surprising alacrity, a significant portion of the military has taken up arms in defense of the people and their rights of liberty. This split in the military has allowed for the people's representatives to seize the power of the legislative and executive branches. While the fighting has only just begun, it is unlikely the present government can be unseated easily. Never again shall the military rule us. Yep, so begins a civil war, which, oh dear God, because of the fact that we controlled already. Yeah, we can assume that really if there is a coup, it's only likely to take over a couple key parts where the military will be able to gain control. And then beyond that, they're not really going to be able to do much. And very quickly, perhaps following a multi-long month investigation, different members of the military are caught, tried, executed even. The military takeover fails. All right, that's what we are going to have to actually kind of say here. So that by really spring of 1936, everything is stabilized within Japan, and the democratic forces are in a significantly stronger position than they arguably would have been in our own time. Not just arguably, but just much, much, much more. Now, the weird thing about the game and what exactly does here is that it freed Korea. And that doesn't really make much sense. That, like, yeah, maybe there's some kind of state where the militaristic officers within Korea try and actually do something, but the actual likelihood of that happening is incredibly unlikely. That makes no sense. Instead, perhaps a greater degree of autonomy is granted to Korea as it becomes a puppet of Japan. Like, this is something where Japan is still going to have a large influence over its politics, but there are going to be limited degrees of liberalism and ideas that take over in here. If anything, if you want to equate it to something, is similar to what? Perhaps the United States' relations to the Philippines, maybe? Something along those lines, where Korea is treated as more of a territory and something that is a subdivision within the Japanese state, if anything. The same thing would actually be said about the Imperial Kwantung territories that you can see over here under the rule of Puyi, which is a independent state here now, where you had the fascist elements from Japan go and take over, as that's the story that it builds in the alternate history of the path in the game. But realistically speaking, that could happen. But the likelihood of it, especially with the democratic forces being that much stronger in Japan, is that doesn't really take place either. The United States wants to limit naval rearmament. Our recent efforts to build a larger fleet have propelled us among the ranks of the major naval powers. The United States feels clearly threatened by our expanded fleet and has sent a delegation to our capital to negotiate a mutual arms limitation treaty. The treaty would be modeled on the Second London Naval Treaty and restrict the size of our capital ships, as well as limit our overall fleet size in capital ships to not exceed the fleet of the United Kingdom. Yes, this is likely something that, with the crackdown on the militaristic elements, then this is probably something that the Navy aspects would have tried to do something or assassinate some ministers here before. They get caught, these terms end up getting accepted, and the militaristic naval aspects within Japanese society are greatly weakened. Instead, after the coups, a Showa constitution is established. We accept and respect our nation's imperial history. However, authoritarianism has no place in Japan we want to build. We will maintain the emperor as a figurehead leader, but we will limit his power in the constitution, much as the case of many Western countries. Yes, this is limited in the sense it's kind of like what we have for the modern Japan, so to speak, but we're going to say this is to a lesser degree. The emperor still has more authority, but it's not going to be as much as we arguably would have seen in, the actual history. Because of all these moves, because of these developments, and because of the increased liberalism within society, this is something that would likely be praised by the United States. This is something that would be praised by the UK, etc. It is something that would lead to increased trade and perhaps even investment opportunities, further increasing the economy of Japan. Meaning, from this time, Japan never runs out of steel, they never run out of oil, they never run out of any of these things, and they actually have a better economy in order to pay for things in the first place. From that, the old alliance with the UK is rekindled. Our best chance lies with our erstwhile ally in the Great War. We will reactivate the old alliance and stand with the United Kingdom in the defense of democracy. We can say that what happens here, like, yeah, we're going to join the allies, but that does not realistically what is going to take place here, at least in the beginning. What is likely to happen is that further trade agreements are going to be established. The allies do not exist yet in 1936, but much greater diplomatic overtures, much greater economic activity, much greater of everything happens between Japan and the UK and more, perhaps even from large-scale then Japanese investment in the varying territories and colonies of the UK, thus allowing Japan to increase the overall amount of resources that its industries get. United Kingdom denies request to join the Game, I'm trying to tell a story here. All right, well, you know what? It's fine. It's whatever. Maybe we can assume that there is some tension in here because Japan still has some desires upon colonies or other kinds of things, even with greater, I don't know. We're going to kind of run with it here and explain things as they go, but Pacific Guardian is still going to be an aspect of Japanese policy. We will assume the role of the guardian of all Asian states in and around the Pacific. Once freed from Western imperialism, they will require a guiding hand to lift them up as full-fledged democracies. Yeah, though again, remember, the militarists aren't going to be completely purged. There's still going to be an aspect of Japan that wants to be able to grow and expand. Now, this aspect of Pacific Guardian that we're talking about here is likely to be more, I guess, political rather than an actual militaristic goal, because we have this whole thing about, assuming stewardship over Indonesia and whatnot, and trying to take the stuff from the Netherlands and Malaya and everything else. Like, look, the reality is, assuming the democratic forces had already been kind of in control of things, there is no real reason for any of this to happen. And I love the fact that this is a thing that is abusable that you can do in a game. But realistically speaking, Japan is not going to have the power and influence to be able to take over any of these things. It's not going to want to do this, and there is no way in hell that the Netherlands or other things are going to give that up. The greatest chance of something like that happening here, and we will say that, is that potentially Indonesia does get taken over by, say, Japan after it is that Netherlands falls when the war breaks out. But Malaya, Indochina, etc., it's iffy. It's iffy. What is likely to happen, though, considering how they're going to have the Soviet Union on their doorstep as well, and also influence is still probably going to be had in Manchuria, is that an anti-communist bulwark is still something that is established, because in this time, yes, the French were somewhat friendly with the Soviet Union, but the UK was not, nor was the United States, and definitely not Germany or pretty much anyone else. So, the principles of democracy are incompatible with communism. We must stand firm against this ideology and thereby protect both ourselves as well as those who rely on us. Perhaps even from the sense, like, yeah, Japan is not going to necessarily abuse China by invading it, but economically and diplomatically, they will likely put pressure on the Chinese to take a stronger stance against the communists, and maybe even aid them in these efforts in order to be able to, well, I mean, we kind of know what ends up happening with officials being bribed, particularly within China, so it is likely that elements of the Chinese government are going to be under the thumb of the Japanese, who are going to invest in them, we will say. Which, in turn, then, by the early 1930s, brings up another question of what exactly to do about Manchuria. See, in the game, the way that it's built out is that the military officers that had taken over Manchuria here are gonna stand against us, and so we have to take that over. Realistically, what would have happened in this time is that there likely would have been a series of efforts where governors, military officials, and others that would have had greater degrees of influence there on the frontier would be tried to be brought back to Japan in order to curtail said influence. Likely some additional police forces and others have to be sent in order to extract them, and potentially you could see some fighting as some military officers that had broken away from the main government do try to resist, though this, again, is likely to be something that is extremely quick and easy. So from this, yeah, we're getting a war goal to go ahead and liberate Manchuria, but even though we say it's a war, it's not really going to be the case. If anything, the much more likely thing to happen is that things are going to just be overthrown very quick. The military governors that were ruling different aspects of territory and officials, etc., are rescinded, and from there, the Japanese democratic forces exert a greater degree of control. Yeah, as you can see, any fighting that potentially takes place is extremely limited, as the Japanese forces, or the militaristic forces in this time, are going to be much weaker. Really, within a matter of, I want to say weeks, but considering how vast of a territory all of this was that Japan controlled, and how many bandits likely have to be cracked down upon, it is likely to still take several months in order to be able to consolidate control over all of it. Eventually, it does though, but instead of direct control being seized by the Japanese and vast amounts of settlers being sent in or anything like that, again, more limited degrees of reforms are likely put in place. Remember, Puyi was put as the guy who was in charge of Japanese Manchukuo, and this was a horribly corrupt, backward state, and it's going to require more intervention by the Japanese in order to be able to exert control over, but it is likely in a sense then that puppet states are still maintained in here in this case, maybe being divided into smaller aspects. The emperor receives a more limited role, if anything. Either way, economically, diplomatically, everything, Japan is in a much stronger position now than it was in our own time. As for the rest of the political aspects of the focus, none of this really makes sense. It makes no sense to demand for sovereignty for the Philippines. None of that is going to happen. Instead, the Manchurian project is likely to still take place. Yes, maybe some limited settling by Japanese settlers, but for the most part, things are going to be focused on industrial expansion and solidifying the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere or limited degrees of it, but it's much more of an economic partnership versus a political partnership as it was in our own time. But here is another major question. Bridge blown. Sometime during the last night, a major railway bridge in Manchuria collapsed under the weight of a passing ammunition train. Rescue and recovery efforts have been made difficult by the secondary explosions from the ammunition. The crew of the train is still missing, presumed dead. Military intelligence has dispatched a team to investigate the site as soon as it is safe to do so, to find out how a sturdy bridge could collapse with no warning signs. Local witness reports seeing a small group in the valley below the bridge on the day before the collapse. Their whereabouts are currently unknown. Yes, Chinese provocation. It is still likely in this time, especially considering the anti-communist stance that the Japanese government would be taking, that communist elements, which were still fairly popular throughout China here, were going to be harassing the Japanese. And this was a core aspect of resisting Japanese imperialism, especially considering that the more capitalist elements of Japan now would be investing vast amounts of money and resources into China, which in turn would likely be pissing off the communist elements. New details have emerged about the latest attack on our soil. While none of the perpetrators have been caught so far, evidence clearly suggests that it was deliberate provocation by the Chinese. The Chinese government has been suspiciously slow in condemning the attack, and Chinese newspapers have hailed it as a heroic act of defiance against Japanese imperialism. The cabinet has assembled to discuss matters and propose measures to deal with the blatant assault. Now, when this happens, there is a good chance that Japan is going to take a very angry stance. However, what we can likely say in these circumstances is that initially an apology is demanded, along with maybe some efforts for capturing the perpetrators, etc., that Japan, with its more democratic leanings, but still a very strong militaristic presence, does this. However, the military is going to be very angry about it. They're not going to have the power and influence to be able to do anything about it, but the Japanese public is going to be quite upset. More investigators are likely to be sent into the area, and this is something that would begin to build a case against the communists, with this information likely being fed to other entities around the world in order to reduce the potential backlash from a military engagement. The question is then, what happens next? And the answer is that likely either a few weeks later or maybe even a few months later, a similar incident takes place. Another bridge is blown, another action happens. And after a second Chinese provocation, well documented, and even with potentially Japanese spy agencies already having captured documents, maybe with the fact that there's cameras having gotten pictures of it, and publicizing this around the world, you would see likely that the United States, the UK, others would not have any issues potentially with seeing a measured Japanese response against the Chinese government. The troops are mobilized and war is prepared for, with, in this sense, the military aspects of Japanese society finally having an outlet for their aggression. Now, the fighting in this sense is not likely to necessarily be quick, it is not likely to be slow, it is likely to proceed at a somewhat measured pace. Here's the thing that we need to understand. When the Japanese first went and invaded China in here, it was done, I'm going to say, as a measured response, but the reality is that the Japanese military thought that it was going to be significantly easier than what it actually was. It is even possible that after seizing the capital in Beijing, that theoretically some kind of peace deal is sought, but the actual likelihood of that is, we don't really know. Assuming that real fighting begins to break out at the beginning of 1939, then it is likely that the northern Chinese part of the state will begin to collapse going into, say, February or so. Again, this does not mean that the fighting is going to be easy, and it is likely that tens of thousands of troops are going to be lost, and the Chinese are going to try and unite behind the idea of defending against Japanese imperialism. But there's also a decent chance that, considering how the Japanese would have been way less militarily involved here before, that the Chinese factions are not nearly unified as they would have already been. Despite the horrendous fighting, and even though some token words may be said by the UK, France, and others, they're not going to really be interfering or trying to support the Chinese in this time. And also at the same time, they will be a little bit more occupied with what is going on with the German Reich. With no embargo against Japan as well as a stronger economy, they will actually be able to pay for oil from other entities. The largest purchaser from which will be the United States, which in this time, considering this war would be breaking out in, say, 1938 heading into 1939, that means that the United States is going to receive a much larger boost to its industry in the same way that it did at the outbreak of World War II, but earlier. With no shortage really of steel, oil, or rubber, the Japanese war machine would be able to kick into full overdrive, producing vast amounts of goods, and from that at the same time, with less of forces being poured necessarily into just the straight military, the goods are not only higher quality, but they're able to produce such a large degree that it's a massive boost to the economy. But oh boy, that is where things get really spicy. Yeah, there's a decent chance that one of the things that is going to go on during this time here is that the communists, which of course would have been potentially working with the central government to fight against the Japanese, may, in a state of seeing a potential stalemate with the Japanese, try and stage their own kind of little revolt in order to go against mainland China. In the event that that actually happens, yes, it is going to wreak some havoc here for the base Chinese troops, or rather, I say for the, Japanese troops that are stationed here in China. But what may potentially happen here in this instance is that it actually gives the Japanese a chance to recuperate themselves, to get a reprieve, because the communists are going to be fighting then against the nationalist central government and give the Japanese a chance to plan out a further attack. As it is, my friends, by 1940, with the communists and the nationalists heavily divided and fighting each other, it would make sense that Japan, through perhaps supporting individual puppet rulers and varying warlords, would be able to assert domination and control over aspects of the state. Of course, this would require massive amounts of innovation and investment, but, I believe that in this time, with a much more friendly Japanese state with the support of the West, would be able to do so. Particularly if they are playing varying puppets off of each other in order to assert control, and not actually trying to directly control it themselves like they did in our own time. From that, Communist China may collapse, a more friendly government is put into place, and China, along with it, collapses. These entities are likely merged into one under a puppet government that is going to be, influenced by the Japanese state, and with that, peace in Asia is achieved. The big question at this point is what exactly happens next, because things have still technically proceeded the exact same as they did in our own time. France did fall, the wars are occurring here in the Balkans. The only real difference is that, so far since it's 1940, the Japanese haven't attacked, but they didn't attack at this time in our own time. It didn't happen until 1941. Theoretically, in this case, with much more industry being pumped out of Japan and with a more pacified China, Japanese industry may be great, that it's kind of like what ended up happening with the Japanese economic miracle, that light industry explodes as Japan is able to sell goods to the United Kingdom and purchases resources from the United States. So yeah, the United States doesn't get necessarily as big of a manufacturing boom because it's not supplying all of the things here for the British in Asia, but they are still supplying things for the British mainland. And on top of that, resources are being bought from the US in order to fuel Japanese industry. So it's a kind of win-win, I guess you could say. And yes, as time goes, Japan does become a more integrated part of the Allied war machine. Likely from this, even if it is only a temporary measure, asserting stewardship over Indonesia. Though not Malaya. That is not something the British would give up, nor would they actually have to. Oh my god, I can assume leadership of the Allies. Yeah, no, Japan is not doing that. That would not make sense. It really is wild, but without British forces having to be stationed to potentially defend things here in Asia and not having to deal with any other threats, it means that vastly more resources are able to be concentrated to the West, thus knocking the Italians completely out of Libya at the beginning of 1941. And just as things play out in our normal time, the German Reich will still go after the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. All of that is still going to take place. We can arguably say that the Germany maybe doesn't do this as much since they won't have Japan on the other side they can encourage to attack, because the Tripart Pact is not really a thing in this new time. We could actually say that, but for the sake of the scenario, we're not going to. Instead, despite the Allies being in a stronger position, they will be occupied with dealing with things in the Balkans, and the Soviets will initially suffer horrendous losses, just as they did against the Germans in our own time, though maybe it won't be to as severe of a degree, we could probably say, because the Germans will have to put more forces on other parts of the front in order to be able to deal with a stronger Allied presence here. Now, despite the fact that, technically speaking, the Allies should be stronger over here, it does not necessarily mean that the Soviets are going to perform any better in the war. No, in fact, they may arguably even perform worse, because thanks to the much stronger Japan that we see over here in the East, the Soviets possibly have a significantly larger force that has been placed over here. Which, because that actually forces many troops off the border, that means that although some of them can be redeployed, in those crucial months, the Soviets are going to have vast amounts of their men completely swept up. But here is where Lend-Lease begins to actually pour into the Soviet Union. Huge amounts of resources are sold over to the Soviets. Artillery pieces, supply equipment, guns, etc. Anything that can possibly be done in order to be able to shore them up, further increasing Japan's economic output. With these new trade deals established, as well as the beginning of Lend-Lease that will come in from other countries, as it is that 1941 turns into 1942 and things begin to go very poorly for the Soviets, a non-aggression pact is established, thus allowing the Soviets to free vast numbers of their forces that would have been over here in Manchuria to be able to go up and try and shore the front line. This would prove to be necessary because considering their weaker position, the Germans could be right outside of the gates of Moscow within a year. From this, with perhaps the promise of greater territorial concessions, Japan could theoretically, at this time, begin to prepare for entry into the war, though in a more limited capacity. Because we need to understand that after a war with China, Japan and the population itself, under more civilian rule, would likely not have any major wish to engage in a major conflict with the Germans, and instead would likely send specialists, whether it is coming in the form of artillery divisions or whether it is coming from, say, aircraft. It is likely that vast numbers of pilots are sent forth as volunteers with vast numbers of Japan's Air Force, which is likely kicked into overdrive, producing things for the war effort because of the fact that, well, Japan has a significantly larger economy here. Pretty soon, under Japanese aid, the air war over Italy begins, and the forces that remain are absolutely torn apart from years of experienced fighting by Japanese forces, combined with, quite frankly, impressive aviation technology. It proves to be remarkably effective. Fall of Moscow. Well, yeah, potentially without the United States being even more heavily involved in this time with no Japanese involvement, yeah, the Soviets could be potentially pushed back even as the Germans continue to bleed out and suffer heavy losses. In the event that that happens, Churchill and the rest of the Allies would be desperate to launch some type of strike into Italy, something which, considering that they wouldn't have to waste resources over here in Asia, would mean far more men are able to take place in this with much better support. Yeah, even without American aid, considering the sheer amount of resources the British would now have at this time, it means that they would likely be able to push into Italy. With Japanese support, of course, being helpful in terms of air resources, as well as likely logistics. The Japanese would have sent engineers, they would have sent in naval assets in order to be able to support the British invasion. It would have proved to be remarkably effective. It's amazing how much of a butterfly effect this is. Yes, the British are in a significantly stronger position here in the West in order to be able to invade against Italy, but without the United States actually entering into the war, it means that much of the men and material that would have been available over here is not here, meaning the British are supplying even more of it, just with greater Japanese aid. Still, though, eventually, under immense pressure, the Italians are going to collapse, especially considering that with a much stronger British Empire in this time, they are able to completely crush things in North Africa much faster, meaning those resources don't get wasted there for, well, years. It is only here, then, potentially, with the fracturing of Italy into civil war, that the invasion of the Soviet Union would stall. Yes, Moscow had fallen, all these other states have fallen, but the big thing is that despite what Mustache Man thought would happen, the collapse of the capital and reaching further into Soviet territory was not going to collapse the Soviet Union. Despite efforts by the Germans to potentially shore up the defensive line here and sustain the Italian regime, that wasn't going to happen, especially considering that since they were more successful in reaching into the Soviet Union and were spread out even thinner, they would not be able to afford to take any troops off of the front line at all. Yeah, what is actually kind of amazing in this is, again, it is entering 1944, and yeah, the Soviets are finally beginning to push back the Germans, who are simply spread far too thin, but simultaneously, the big issue is that with the United States not joining in on the conflict, instead just continuing to supply more and more guns and supplies in the same way that Japan is, the war has almost reached a kind of stalemate here in Italy. Fall of Stalingrad, oh my god. Without the United States, it really is that bad. Even Stalingrad has fallen. Oh, it looks like in June, there's D-Day, and it is... one landing may succeed. Wow. The French have landed and are desperately trying. Yep, D-Day fails. Simply, without American support, it does not work. Now, eventually, as things get particularly bad, there's a good chance, whether it's from German submarine raiding, something happening, the United States does likely eventually join the war, though this may not take place until 1944, maybe 1945. A failed D-Day invasion and more would mean that the US finally comes into the conflict. Oh my God, the Soviet Union is so weak in this time in here that even with the Paris being liberated, the war against Iran actually succeeds in holding back the Allies. Incredible. Still, D-Day a year later than it was in our own time, it is not until the beginning of May of 1945 that Paris is actually liberated and a march towards Berlin begins. Bloody, awful, and brutal, and led by fresh American blood pouring into the scene as the British were stuck for years in Italy. Naturally, as German forces are forced to withdraw from the Soviet line to go back and cover their rear, the Soviets finally begin their counterattack, hoping to be able to reclaim their own capital soon before it is that, well, the Allies take the rest of Europe. Really, the extreme late entrance of the Americans into the war would actually be the thing that would be the deciding factor here. And I know that a number of you probably look at me and go, oh yeah, so Japan, did you hold off specifically doing this in order to be able to avoid having Japan take all the glory and let it be the United States? No, because I cannot really imagine a world in which after a war with China, which would be a bloody war costing hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives to actually fight out, that this is something that Japan would then turn around and go, yes, we are going to send 1 million men over in order to fight against the Germans. That's not happening. Instead, no, gradually, as summer turns to fall of 1945, just as the same would happen in our own time where Japan was bombed with the nuclear bomb, the same would likely also take place within Germany, with Berlin being bombed, potentially Munich and other key targets. As German army units are essentially cut off from contact from the capital and lose all cohesion, it would allow forces from both the east and west to be able to pour in through the gaps, exploiting and beginning a mass rout across the entire line. What did that say? What? The Yunnan Republic? Wait, Soviet warfare. Soviet Union decided to attack China? What? Yeah, that shouldn't happen. That game, you always find a way to screw with my story. Yeah, end of 1945, beginning of 1946. It is only here that Germany fully does collapse, as Berlin is taken and the entire forces are routed, with the Europeans actually in this time, considering the worst Soviet position, have managed to take in the majority of Europe. Until finally, the war is over. Really, at this point, there would be nothing for the Japanese to really gain from this conflict. They don't get any more necessarily islands. They don't get any more in the way of resources. They don't really, they get rich. That's the big thing. In this peace deal, the Japanese become rich. The British are naturally in this time going to end up dividing much of Europe, and the Soviet Union, despite suffering as much as they did, would likely still have agreed to a peace deal. Or not a peace deal, a treaty where they would be able to carve Europe up into spheres of influence, but with how badly beaten back they would have been in this time, and with how much the Allies would have taken, they would have been able to gain a greater degree of influence, likely taking the entirety of Germany, heading down into the Balkans, but many of the Balkan states, from Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and then heading up to like Poland and the Baltic states, would still be under the Soviet thumb. That's honestly where I'm going to end it here today, guys. This ended up way too long to be able to create in the first place. The short of it is that if Japan had stayed allies with the UK, it wouldn't have drawn in the United States, which is like one of the key backers that was actually necessary in order to be able to really push things forward. So the Allies still win. They do eventually win. It just takes a hell of a lot longer. That's it. I'm done. I've been doing this for like 10 hours at this point. Goodbye, everyone. Make sure to leave your comments down in the comment section below for what we should do next. I will see you all next time. I gotta go to sleep.